We've got it.
We know what we're doing.
We know what we're doing, yes. Hi, bonsoir, good evening to you all. My name is Deborah Powell, and I'm the president of the Friends of Shaw Falls. And just like to do some reminders about etiquette, basic Zoom etiquette, which is to have your microphones closed. And during the presentation, you can have your cameras closed as well, which reduces the number of megabytes that the actual recording ends up being, which somehow I think is important. So again, I say welcome, and I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which many of us are gathering, perhaps not all, is the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. And we recognize the Anishinaabe as the customary keepers and defenders of the Kitchissippi watershed and its tributaries, and we honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory. And we do our best to uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation, the Anishinaabe. Et traditionally, the Friends of Shaw Falls, les Amis de Sault-des-Chats, fait des choses dans les deux langues. Donc, je vais dire bienvenue et que nous tenons d'abord à souligner que les terres sur lesquelles nous sommes rassemblés, ou la plupart de nous sommes rassemblés, font partie du territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Anishinaabe Algonquin, présente en ces lieux depuis les temps immémoriaux. On reconnaît que les Anishinaabeg sont les gardiens et défenseurs traditionnels du bassin hydrographique de la Kitchissippi, la grande rivière des Outaouais, et de ses affluents. Nous saluons leur longue tradition d'accueil dont ont bénéficié de nombreuses nations dans ce magnifique territoire, et nous nous engageons à défendre et à promouvoir la voix et les valeurs de notre nation hôte. A little introduction to who we are, Les Amis de Sault-des-Chats, the Friends of Shaw Falls. We are a group of volunteers who were incorporated in 2017 as a not-for-profit corporation. Our mission is to promote the cultural, historical, and natural wealth of the Shaw Falls region of the Ottawa River watershed through interpretive programs and sustainable recreational activities that are respectful of the exceptional native biodiversity of the area. If you're wondering where we are, we straddle two MRCs. At their southern ends, the MRC Pontiac to the southeast and the MRC des Collines de l'Outaouais to the southwest, taking in part of the municipalities of Bristol and of Pontiac. And if you know where Quillon is, that will help you find us on the map. So, Les Amis de Sault-des-Chats est un organisme à but non lucratif fondé en 2017 dont la mission est de promouvoir les richesses patrimoniales, historiques et naturelles de la région de Sault-des-Chats dans le bassin versant de la rivière des Outaouais par le biais des programmes d'interprétation et d'activités récréatives durables qui respectent sa biodiversité indigène exceptionnelle. If you're not familiar with the area, the question might have popped into your head, well, why there? In addition to being part of the region that's exceptionally rich in native biodiversity, and I would refer you to our YouTube channel, Les Amis de Sault-des-Chats, the Friends of Shaw Falls, where there's a great presentation on the natural wealth of the area, both a French version and an English version. We also have some very interesting settler history. Samuel de Champlain wrote about our Chats Falls 400 years ago. A couple of hundred years later, we had a horse railway in the days when any kind of railway was something very special. We had some booming villages with some of the most advanced technology for lumber mills in the area, courtesy of John Egan and others of his ilk, the lumber barons. And the stretch of the Ottawa River was part of a grand project to build a Georgian Bay Canal, an alternative shipping route to the St. Lawrence River. In sum, the area has seen some really interesting European-related and settler history, and a lot of our organization's activities have been about that, including in part, at least, our Archeo-Pontiac project, which I will talk about after the presentation. But all that is really just a blink of the eye compared to the thousands of years of First Nations habitation. And Jean-Luc Pilon, archaeologist, is with us this evening to help us better appreciate that long history from an archaeological perspective. But in his words, so that we will see the beautiful landscape of our region in a new way and better appreciate the rich legacy of the Anishinabe Algonquin culture. And I would add that legacy that lives on today in the Anishinaabe people and that holds lessons for our present and for our future. I'm just going to move on to introducing our speaker, Jean-Luc Pilon. He's a Valley boy. He was born and raised in Vankleek Hill, Ontario. It's the other side of Ottawa or Gatineau. He studied anthropology and archaeology at the Universities of Toronto and Laval, obtaining his PhD in anthropology from the University of Toronto. His archaeological fieldwork has ranged across the top of the continent, from central and northern Quebec through the Hudson Bay lowlands to the lower Mackenzie Valley. He's also participated in fieldwork in Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego, in southernmost Chile, and on First World War battlefields in northern France. During his more than 33-year-long career at the Canadian Museum of History, he participated in a number of exhibitions, including Kichisibi, our region's past, which is now permanently exhibited at the Kitigan-Zibi Anishinaabe Cultural Center, which is close to Maniwaki. There's also the People of the Longhouse module in the museum's First Peoples Hall. Also, First Peoples of Canada, Masterworks from the Canadian Museum of Civilization, an exhibition that toured internationally. And also the First Contacts module in the newly opened Canadian History Hall. His publications include First Peoples of Canada, Masterworks from the Canadian Museum of Civilization, which he co-authored with Nicolette Prince, and which has been published in a number of languages. And it looks like it might still be available through the museum bookstore. Dr. Pilon is an adjunct research professor at Carleton University. For more than 20 years, he has been a member of the Archaeology Committee of the Pan American Institute of Geography and History and co-editor of that institution's journal, which I won't try to pronounce because my Spanish is not very good. He's past president of the Ontario Archaeological Society and has served as web editor for the Canadian Archaeological Association. I think without further ado, I will turn the screen over into our hopeful screen sharing situation and let Jean-Luc have the evening.
So we all cross our fingers
Cross
at
our
the same
fingers.
time. You'll just give me a nod, Deb, if it works. Good?
Ah, c'est beau.
Bon.
Merci.
Alors, merci pour l'invitation. Merci pour l'accueil. Last summer, some of you may have been in Quillon when I gave a talk on some of the highlights or some bits and pieces of local ancient history. And I was going to do the same again tonight, but then I thought to myself, maybe I should add a little bit. So it's a little enhanced. So if you saw it last summer, then you will see something new tonight. And as Deb mentioned, we are in unceded Anishinaabe territory. Now, you know, the term or the expression unceded means that according to our laws, or the laws of Canada. We have no business being here. There has been no negotiations to allow us to access this land. And so I think that when we talk about reconciliation, one of the important things that we need to do is understand what that heritage is. You know, everybody prizes their heritage, and it's good to know what the indigenous Anishinabe Algonquin heritage is about to understand why people are so attached to this land. And so hopefully that's going to be one of the outcomes that tonight we'll have a better understanding of that. So we'll look at some of the broad brushstroke, but we won't look at it all. That's not my intention. What I'm going to do is share with you what my truth is, my understanding of some of the archaeological things that have been found. I have no pretension that this is the truth. I'm going to share with you some of the facts, some of my understandings of them. I'm sure there are many others who will have equally valid interpretations of some of those. So let's get cracking. Now, I think before we can talk about how people have lived on this land, we have to understand a little bit about the land itself. This is the Ottawa Valley, 15,000 years ago, covered in ice. We are under a continental glacier. It's been there for tens of thousands of years. This is a good look at what North America would have looked like. So Canada did not exist. Up until about 15,000 years ago, we were under a kilometer of ice. Now you can just imagine what effects a kilometer of ice will have on the Earth's crust. It pushed it down quite naturally. When the ice melted and the Earth started to rebound, started to retake its shape, but that was a long process. But this is certainly the first look at the Ottawa Valley 15,000 years ago. Now, as the ice melted, of course, water is being produced. And because the land has been pushed down so much over that sort of Hudson's Bay area, the land is all tilted northward, and the land is trying to drain in that direction, but it's being impounded and it's forming these huge glacial lakes. At the same time, because the land had been pushed down so far, at a certain point, the sea enters the St. Lawrence and goes up the Ottawa because the land is so much lower. Now, this is a map showing you the maximum extent of the Champlain Sea. At no time did you have a water body this big. You can just imagine that when the ice was further south than is illustrated in this image, this might have been how far the water was coming from the sea, but it was being blocked by, as the ice receded north, so did the shorelines move. And that's an important thing about the Champlain Sea, is it is changing size and dimensions fairly rapidly. So starting from about 12,800 years, that is when the ice starts to leave the area and the waters of the sea come into the Ottawa Valley. Now, waters of the sea, an inland sea, maximum depth, for example, in the Ottawa area is about 220 meters. So when you stand, let's say, at the Museum of History and you look up, 220 meters worth of salt water is above your head. So that means that you have an environment that is amenable to saltwater fish species, saltwater mammals or sea mammals. For example, here we have the ongoing excavations in the early 1970s of a bowhead whale at White Lake, in the sort of middle Ottawa Valley. Now, a bowhead whale, there's a beluga beside it. Those of you who've been to, I don't know, SeaWorld, you might recognize the size of the beluga. They're fairly big. Bowhead whale is much bigger. It's one of the largest mammals on Earth. It's 40 tons of mammal. And so to have an animal like that up and down the Ottawa Valley, you're talking about a large environment, deep waters, but a very rich environment to be able to support that kind of wildlife. Okay. So here we have one look at the Great Lakes when the ice was receding. The ice is being pounded up against or the water is melting and pounding up against the receding ice. And you will notice that the upper Great Lakes and the lower Great Lakes are distinct. They're not connected. And that's kind of an important thing. Even by 9,500, you see the upper Great Lakes are draining through the Ottawa Valley. They are not connecting to the Lakes Erie and Ontario and into the St. Lawrence. And so that means that even after the Champlain Sea recedes, so imagine the land is starting to tilt back up, and you don't have the flow going northward, you have the flow going into the St. Lawrence. You still have a lot more water than the river is used to, or we're used to seeing today. And that's a situation that only changed about 4,700 years ago. 4,700 years ago, the connection between Huron and Erie becomes a permanent one. And then you get a very sudden lowering of the Ottawa River down to something more akin to its modern day levels. This is another very interesting image that shows you how the channel, the dark blue line is the modern channel of the Ottawa River, but at different times you had all sorts of other channels digging into the landscape at the bottom of the Champlain Sea. And so again, you see that it's very dynamic. Things are moving around. So just imagine that when these landscapes become available to people, and the rivers are changing and the rivers are lowering 4,700 years ago, people are having to adapt to these new conditions. So that you're going to have different wildlife, you're going to have different vegetation, and all of these things. And so people have to figure out how to live in that new and changing environment. Now, I know most people wonder, why am I looking at a pollen diagram? It's only interesting for a couple reasons. This is 12,000 years at the bottom. And this is 10,000 years where I've got the first red line going across. And then at 1,000 years is another change. And all I'm doing is trying to show you that in the very beginning, shortly after the land is freed of ice and the Champlain Sea is establishing itself, you've got a lot of spruce trees. Pine trees, these two are pine trees. They're going to come later. You've got spruce, you've got a lot of cedar, or eastern hemlock rather, and a lot of herbs or grasses. But the important thing, so basically, the ice goes away, Champlain Sea comes in, you probably get something that is akin to a tundra, a very harsh environment. And this last part on the right, it tells you how much pollen is actually being found in the sediments. And it basically is saying there's not much pollen. These are the proportions. Okay, so you've got basically spruce, hemlock, lots of grasses, but there's not much of it. So that means that it's probably a tundra environment, and it starts to change. In the first large period here, you've got a switching from, what is that, jack pine to white pine. Birch is coming in strong. And then in the later times, jack pine more or less becomes a very minor component, and white pine becomes the major component along with birch. And here's some, what is that? Cedar, I think, Thuya canadensis, or hemlock, or occidentalis. So the vegetation, the point here is that the vegetation is changing through time. Nothing is static, nothing lasts forever. And it just has to do with the evolving environment and the changing weather conditions and climatic conditions that go along with this. So this is sort of the stage that we have to set when we look at the landscape here. Remember that it is one that has been dynamic for thousands of years. The animal species that were adapted to this environment changed. The flora changed, the plants changed, and so people had to slowly adapt to all of these changing conditions. And that's probably the most important hallmark. Yes, this is happening over many, many generations. It's not something that happens overnight, but still people have to keep on their toes and adapt to those new changing conditions. So there's the stage. Let's look at some of the actors, or at least some of the things that played out on that stage. The valley, Quillon, uh, the sort of center of the universe for the Shaw Falls community. What things that might have been found in the area that are of interest? Well, let's just go across the river, not very far, in the Marshalls Bay area. Now, in the 1920s, I believe, a Presbyterian minister found this on a beach. Eventually, it made its way into the collections of what is today the Canadian Museum of History. It's soapstone. It's obviously a turtle. Is it old? Well, it's before 1920s. I would suggest that it could be pre-contact as much as it could be early contact. That doesn't matter. The point is that you have the representation of a turtle, and we know that Turtle Island, or the North American continent, is compared to a turtle. There are stories that explain the existence or the creation of the continent by mud being placed on the back of a turtle because somebody was falling. Sky Woman was falling from the heavens, and she would otherwise have drowned. And so the turtle is significant symbolically for a lot of peoples of this continent, the original peoples of this continent. So they appreciate this small turtle. It's only about the size of, I don't know, fits in the palm of your hand quite easily. And this little turtle went on tour around the world. Starting in 2008, the Canadian Museum of Civilization at the time had an exchange of exhibitions with the National Museum of China. The National Museum of China was, of course, gearing up for the Olympics that opened in 2008. And they wanted to revamp their National Museum, which was right on Tiananmen Square. And so for a few years before that, they loaned out the best of their collections to museums around the world. Took care of storage, a pretty good plan. And they asked the Museum of Civilization for a reciprocal exhibition. And they asked specifically, they wanted to see treasures from the first peoples of Canada. And so Nicolette Prince and I were the curators, and we put together this exhibition. And when you first came into the exhibition, you would see, I think it was 8 or 10 pieces that we called treasures. They were masterworks, things that were absolutely spectacular. And this little turtle was one of them. So it was shown in Beijing. It was shown in Osaka, Japan the following year, Hanover, Germany, and it ended in Mexico City. So thousands and thousands of people from around the world saw that turtle and appreciated it for its value. Yet here in the Ottawa Valley, we sort of don't know about it. And so there it is. You see, it's quite small. Look at this big case. This is in Hanover. And in a way, the point that was being made is it may be small, but it is very symbolically powerful. So this is something that came from just across the river in Quillon. Back at Quillon, we're going to go up to the Pembroke area. That's not too far, where there are some sites there that are really pretty unique in terms of North American archaeology. They date to about 5,000. There's two of them. One is about 5,500 years old, and the other one about 6,000 years old. Now it's got each of them have very rich collections, including pipstone tools. These are just a sample of the points that were found there. Groundstone tools, so these are probably heavy woodworking tools. Bone tools for bone to have preserved for over 5,000 years. That's pretty remarkable. And you have all sorts of implements here. probably linked to fishing that was going on in a very big way at both of these sites. Now, they coincide with rapids on the Ottawa River, but also found at both of these sites, the 5,500-year-old and the 6,000-year-old sites, are items made of native copper. Native copper in North America has now, the working of native copper has been extended to as far as 9,500 years ago, as old as in on the other side of the Atlantic in I think it is Eastern Europe, where there are dates on the same order of magnitude, 9,500, 10,000 years ago. Native copper is interesting because it is cold hammered and then annealed. When the metal starts to get brittle, people knew to heat it to a certain temperature in an open fire, and that changed the physical properties, the crystal structure of the metal, and they could resume cold hammering it. And so you can see that they were making very fine implements, very thin bracelets. And these were found not only finished implements, but also raw materials indicating that they were making things there as well. And they were found in ways we can certainly count the number of pieces, but we can also weigh it. There was that much found on those sites. And that copper comes from the western end of Lake Superior. That is traveling a long distance. There is no other site in Eastern North America that has this much copper in one location. So those are two extremely important sites. You can see the beauty of the pieces are beyond reproach. And this is in the Ottawa Valley, and it speaks to the subject of trade, long distance trade, and networks. Now, there are other things in the Ottawa Valley that speak to that as well. There have been discoveries made at a number of sites along the Ottawa River that show stone, for example, that comes from the tip of Labrador. It's called it's a kind of a quartzite. It's called Rama quartzite. Comes from the tip of Labrador, and the tip of Labrador in a straight line is the same distance as here to Winnipeg, Manitoba, in a straight line. And we know things did not travel in straight lines in the past. You've got mountain range along the coast, you've got lakes and rivers and streams, and you've got different groups in between. So these tell us about social relationships. Not only were they trade networks, but they were trade networks that were based on different peoples coming together, peoples who spoke different languages, had different cultures. So it really tells us about these long distance relationships on a continental scale 5,000, 6,000 years ago. And it's all sort of funneling through the Ottawa Valley. Now, if you wanted to read about that, there are some articles and publications that are written by and for archaeologists. But if you want to learn about those sites that have yielded copper, you have to go to the Oiseau Rock Trail, which is even further beyond Pembroke, and it overlooked Oiseau Rock or Rocher de l'Oiseau. Rocher de l'Oiseau is a beautiful location. In 1886, the Chevalier de Troyes and some of the d'Iberville boys were going up. They were going up to James Bay to surprise the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, that's the ultimate sneaking up into your backyard. They basically went overland to surprise the English at their bayside trading posts, and they wound up taking several of them. But when the Chevalier de Troyes passed this rock, some of the traveling companions, the indigenous traveling companions, made offerings there. Now, I don't know if the Chevalier de Troyes realized why they were making offerings. Well, for the same reason that if you go there today, you've got Aaron and Jimbo and Teresa and Brian and Eric and Sean and Scott and Donna and many, many others have left their marks. Well, unbeknownst to them, they are, in some cases, painting over some red ochre petroglyphs, rock art that has been left there for who knows how many centuries, if not thousands of years. And so it's a very, very important place in terms of the ritual landscape that people have understood there for a long time. So if you go to the trail that at the top of the cliffs, basically, you will have the story of the long distance trade in copper explained to you here. And you'll recognize this bracelet. I showed it to you just a few minutes ago. So oddly enough, that really important story is really hard to access here in the Ottawa Valley. So back at Quillon, we're going to go this time to Deep River. Deep River is getting up there, you're going to say to me. And we find this pot. This pot was found in the 1960s, I believe, by a fellow from Deep River. Or was it Chalk River? I'm not sure which. Barry Mitchell. Barry Mitchell was let's call him an amateur archaeologist. He was quite interested in archaeology, but he was also very cognizant of needing to do it according to ways that made it acceptable to professional colleagues. Well, one day Barry found this pot. You can see in many pieces. Put it together. It's now at the Museum of History. This is a type of pot, the shape of it, but also the way it is decorated. You see on the outside, probably using basketry to tap against the wet clay. It left an impression of fibers, twisted fibers, on the outside and on the inside. And the thing about this pot that is really significant is it's probably on the order of anywhere around 2,500 to 3,000 years old. And that pot is of a type that is the first pot, the first kind of pottery that is being introduced to Canada south of the tree line, because there is pottery way up in the Mackenzie Delta and then the northern Yukon. But south of the tree line, pottery was making a move north. It had started thousands of years ago, and it entered southern Ontario probably around 3,000 years ago, more or less. And this is usually what you will find on an archaeological site is a piece, a sherd. And from the impressions on it, the decorations, maybe the general shape, you can conclude that it is of that kind of pottery we call Vinette 1. And this is a complete pot. It is something to behold. And if some of you were at the Museum of History, oh, I don't know, I think this exhibition was in the hallway in front of the First People's Hall. And it was a series of pots to show the craftsmanship, ceramic craftsmanship from across Canada through time in pre-contact times. And there was the pot on exhibit here. Keep your eye on this one as well. And that pot, to me, was so significant that when we put together the exhibition that went to China and Osaka and Hanover and Mexico City, it was included among the specimens we're traveling. I'll show you a little bit more on that later. Again, in the Quillon area, when we look at some of the collections that we have at the Museum of History, there are some pieces that come from the James Lusk farm, which is near Luskville, obviously, that are exceptional. Now, James Lusk donated or sold, not quite sure which, to the museum in the 1895 or so, two whole pots that he had found. Now, one of them is said to have come out of the side of a small stream during the spring freshet. So maybe some high waters in the spring, high fast water eroded a pot out of the side of a stream, but it was complete. And then the second one was said to have come from a rock shelter just above his house. Now, this photograph on the left, you might notice a little bit, if you've got good eyes, you'll realize that this is cement here. And he had basically, there's a little stream that comes down the hill, and he had put a little cofferdam. It's a little pipe. There's the pipe sticking out of it. And this is how he had maintained a supply of water, apparently, for his cattle. And this would be a constant flow coming down there all year long. So this would be a natural place for people who might have been camped nearby to come and get water. This shelter here, some of you might recognize Ian Badgley. He's an archaeologist with the National Capital Commission. He and I went out there one day and we were looking up the hill near this along either side of the stream, and we found these two boulders that formed a small protection or protected area that could be seen as a kind of a shelter, which would be an ideal spot to leave a pot because you're intending to come back and for whatever reason you never do. That might be the case. But here are the pots that James Lusk found. They are complete and they're perfect and they're beautiful. Now, they are also of a very distinctive style, especially the one on the right here, as a style that was common along the St. Lawrence River, all the way from Lake Ontario to beyond Quebec City to Stadacona, mouth of the Saguenay. And it is a style that when Jacques Cartier came up the St. Lawrence in 1534, he would have seen the local people using this kind of pottery. It's distinctive in the use of these punctates, these little circular impressions, the way that you've got these little waves, these castellations we call, the shape of the neck, the way the pots are constructed. It's very typical of St. Lawrence Iroquois peoples. Now, Cartier meets St. Lawrence Iroquois peoples at Stadacona in Quebec City, at Hochelaga, Montreal. Archaeologically, we see them, as I say, from basically Saguenay to Lake Ontario. When Samuel de Champlain comes up the St. Lawrence River in 1608, he does not meet a single St. Lawrence Iroquois. Something happened, something very significant happened to either make that group, the St. Lawrence Iroquois, leave for whatever reason. Was it competition with neighboring groups for trade that was beginning to establish itself? Was it the introduction of diseases? You can probably be pretty sure that that impacted local populations. Whatever the case, they ceased to be found archaeologically historically in the St. Lawrence Valley. Now we find these two pots on this one farm near Luskville. Actually, there's a third pot that was found on a couple farms over, and it was found complete as well. And it's also the St. Lawrence Iroquois. You see the little waves, the castellations, the circular impressions, the shape of the pot. So one idea that has been suggested is that the Anishinabe Algonquin allowed a group of St. Lawrence Iroquois to come and establish themselves in their homeland at this very tumultuous time period of the late 1500s, early 1600s. We don't know. This is something that needs to be further studied, but certainly these spectacular pots speak eloquently of a time when people are moving around and the landscape culturally is changing a lot. So this is a picture of one of the display cases showing pottery from throughout Canada. As all of this is pre-contact, but also some modern productions that are inspired by earlier, older pots. This is in Mexico City. So these all traveled together in that exhibition that went from Beijing, Osaka, Hanover, Mexico City. There you've got the Deep River pot, the Vinette 1 pot, that is the oldest pot in southern Canada. And there you've got one of the pots from Luskville. So once again, you've got some local artifacts that were viewed and appreciated by people around the world a few years ago. And unfortunately, if you're local, you rarely have the opportunity of encountering these pieces. Okay. So now if we go to Constance Bay in the collections of the museum, there's one sherd here, one piece of pottery. It's from the rim of a pot that again is got decorative characteristics that are quite similar to what we find in St. Lawrence Iroquoian sites. So we might conclude that maybe somebody had a St. Lawrence Iroquoian pot, maybe somebody made a copy of a St. Lawrence Iroquoian pot, or maybe there was a St. Lawrence Iroquoian person who dropped their pot. That's at Constance Bay. If you go to Pointe-à-l'Indienne, near Quillon, there has been, people have known of archaeological sites there for a long time. And in the 1980s, an archaeologist from the museum, what is today the Museum of History, Roger Marois, went there, did some research and found at least one sherd, which looks exactly like one of those Luskville pots with the circular punctates, the circular impressions, that wavy crest along the edge. Again, it's suggesting St. Lawrence Iroquoian contact or presence. So you put all of these pieces together and you start to see that there is more than just a dot on the map. There are several, and there's a story here that needs to be studied a little bit more. And there is a group from the University of Montreal who are interested in pursuing the whole question of presence of St. Lawrence Iroquoian materials in this part of the Ottawa Valley to try to understand why it's there and what it means. So these are those pieces that I just showed you. This is from Constance Bay, Pointe-à-l'Indienne. These are from the Lusk farm. So not only did he find two whole pots, but he also found in the field in front of his house a piece of a smoking pipe and a piece from another pot. So there's clearly a presence. It's not just somebody who stashed something. There is a real presence in and around that area. So I'm getting near the end, and for those of you who heard about the archaeology project last summer that took place at La Pointe-à-l'Indienne, it did not take place on a pre-contact site, clearly, but the archaeology of the Ottawa Valley is not only about pre-contact ancient history. There is also, as Deb alluded to, a lot of interesting historic history that took place in this part of the Ottawa Valley. And here, for those of you who have the keen eyes, you will notice the corner of a foundation. And this was an archaeology project that was organized by the Friends of Shaw Falls. And Audrey Lapointe from the school in Quillon was involved, Maud Emmanuel Lampert, Maxime Lheureux, Deb Powell, Joanne Brownlee, and others. And they put together an archaeological project that was a public archaeology project. And the idea was to help make people aware that literally, quite literally in their own backyards, there are things that can be very important and very interesting. Here, for example, is the corner of a building that is probably associated either with the Northwest Company at the early 19th century or the Hudson's Bay Company. Either way, it is speaking to us about not only people passing through, but people staying and starting to settle. And it speaks to us about the importance of the fur trade economy before the trees became the focal point. Local people were involved in excavating these sites. We had some consultants from a firm in the Montreal area, Gina Vincelli and Luce Archambault, who were the archaeologists, and they oversaw the work. They made sure that the work was done according to standards that allows us to then take this material and make sense of it and try to understand what is the period that's represented, what are the activities, to try to link this to historical archives and documents. So it was a lot of fun. We had a lot of people come out and participate. You can see here a little ledge on which you would probably put the not the rafters, the joists, the floor joists. Okay, so this is to support the floor. And there were 2 or 3 or 4 areas opened up, and there was ways of linking this to early maps, and the students certainly all got into it, and I think everybody had a good time. So I think this demonstrated, at least to these young people, that the area has a lot of stories to tell. The area is rich. Now, I've only shown you, I've done cherry picking. I've done cherry picking of a bowl of cherries. So I've only picked out the really nice things, or the things that are have a lot of stories. But there are several other sites in the area. There have been a lot of studies done, for example, in the Ottawa area more recently. But it's the question is finding ways of sharing this with people. And this tonight is an exceptional way of doing it, reaching people where they literally live, to help you understand that you do have really interesting, this land has really interesting stories to tell us. It speaks volumes about how people lived in the past and how people adapted and were ingenious in coming up with ways of living on the land. And so again, as I mentioned at the beginning, what I think is important about hearing these stories and being cognizant and aware of what the land has to tell us about the past is that it also tells us about the people of today. And it also tells us about the Anishinabe and Algonquin communities and their relationship with the land that does span thousands of years. And to me, it gives texture, it gives color to the statement that people have been here since time immemorial. It allows us to see how things moved and changed through time and related to different areas. People did not live in vacuums, they did not live on little islands, and they were part of larger trends that sometimes span quite literally the continent. So that is where I'm going to end. I will stop sharing the screen, and hopefully you won't all disappear and we can have a few questions.
There you are.
There I am.
I will unmute myself and just invite people, if they do have questions for Jean-Luc, to unmute themselves. All others, please stay muted because background noise is distracting. And you can also use the thingy at the bottom to put your hand up so we notice you. Are there any questions? Or you could just wave like Harry's waving.
Jean-Luc, you mentioned at one stage that the water coming out of the Great Lakes was coming down the Ottawa. It wasn't going through Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And that was about 5,000 years ago. So anything that was found in the Ottawa Valley, would that be after, when the waters got lower, or would?
Well, no, because if you look at those 2 sites at Pembroke, they're on the order of 5,500 to 6,000 years. Now, honestly, I'm not sure of what the difference of water levels would have been prior to about 4,700 years ago. It might be several feet. So that just means that the active shores were further away than they are today.
Yeah.
That makes a challenge for archaeologists to understand. But when I think of that dramatic lowering of the Ottawa River, because we're talking about the upper Great Lakes, so Superior and Michigan and Huron were somehow making it into the Ottawa Valley. I think about, for example, the Chaudière Falls. What would they have been like 5,000 years ago, before when you've got all that upper Great Lakes flowing into the Ottawa? Was it just maybe just rapids at the time? And if that was the case, that means that people quite literally would have seen those falls being created. And you can imagine the magic moment. I'm using that with a small m, but how impressive it would have been to suddenly, within maybe a generation, have this fall emerge. I mean, I remember the first time I biked to work. I live in Elmer, and I biked to the museum, and I took the path there that goes through the bush, the bike path. And as I approached the Deschênes Rapids, just the Deschênes Rapids, there was this sound, this noise, this roar. It was in the springtime, and you could hear the power. I wasn't sure what it was until I got there. And I can just imagine what it must be like when the Chaudière Falls were free. And when they would roar in the spring, it must have been without the din of trucks and cars. And it must have been absolutely incredible to hear. And when you literally saw that emerge from the waters as the water levels lowered, it must have been incredible. Absolutely. I often think of that.
Yeah. I have one other question regarding the pots. Some of those early pots you showed with the nice decorations and the shapes up top, incredible. But how did they make them? Because when you get down a little bit where it necks in, and then this beautiful round pot, how would they have made those?
Well, the earlier pots are made with a technique called coiling. So basically, at least this is how it's been reconstructed by people who look at the structure of the clay. There are breaks. So people would, and there are people who have made and still make pots through using the coiling technique. You take your clay once you've tempered it, and you make long ropes of it, maybe the size of your thumb. And you start by the opening. You coil them, and then you'll smooth them off and try to sort of weld them together as you get towards the bottom. And as you get towards the bottom, you put a lump on and you try to smooth it on, but it invariably will be a thicker piece. And this is what we always find in those earlier pots. So they're making them upside down, and they're coiling and smoothing and trying to pat them. The rounder ones are probably being made in baskets of some kind, and they're using large lumps of clay that they are putting together and patting together and welding together, but probably in some kind of a soft, pliable form. And again, people have looked at the structures, the microscopic structures, to try to figure out what the techniques were to make them. But they are absolutely beautiful. And some of the pipes that people would make, they're burnishing the outside of them. They look nearly polished. It's incredible.
Okay, we'll move on to Jean-Pierre Knight. You have a question, Jean-Pierre?
Yes, I do. It has to do with digs. Have you been done digs for other posts, like I mean trading posts, other than the one at Quillon?
Well,
on the Ottawa or whatever.
On the Ottawa, I for one thing, I'll point out that I did not. I was just helping out on the excavations last summer at the Pointe Aléncienne. I've worked at an HBC trading post on Hudson's Bay. In fact, it's interesting because I mentioned how
which one? Moose Factory, Albany,
Fort Severn.
Okay.
Fort Severn, and when Chevalier de Troyes went up the Ottawa River overland to take the one or two of the posts on James Bay, Pierre Lemoine d'Iberville was with him. And Pierre Lemoine d'Iberville, a few years later, went to Fort Severn and he destroyed that post. And that's a post that I went and I
That's
did
right.
a little bit of work at.
He took for prisoner Humphrey Martin, which is my ancestor.
Oh, Humphrey Martin's an ancestor of yours.
Yeah.
Well, Humphrey, he reestablished the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Severn, where the community is today, on the 20th of September, 1759, a week
Okay.
after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. That's another story. I won't bore you with that, but that's interesting, Humphrey Martin.
Okay. 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 Thank you. It's just because I discovered that I'm doing some work on Joseph Mondion, and I originally thought he was the first one in the region to establish a post, but it wasn't him. There was a guy that beat him to it 1 year before. His name is Gabriel Foubert. And he was at what we call, or they call, La Barrière, which is near the Lièvre, l'embouchure de la Lièvre. It could be, now you can find that documentation because he did apply for wastelands, true, you know, and but he never got a lot. Actually, he was never allotted one, but you can find the documentation at Public Archives Canada. Anyways, he does say in there, or he does claim to be the first one, and that was in 1785. So just 1 year before Joseph Mondion. And Gabriel Foubert is somehow related or a friend of Joseph Mondion's wife, or his wife's family, because Gabriel Foubert's father was at their marriage ceremony, you know, when the marriage contract and the marriage itself. So they're all interrelated. There's another one called Joseph Lécuyer, which is Joseph Mondion's brother-in-law. Joseph Lécuyer had one trading post at Allumette and or Calumet, I can't remember which one, and also up at Lièvre, up north of Lac des Sables. So
Yeah, the fur trading community was remarkably small.
It was.
Yeah, certainly the guys with the paddles, there's lots of them, but the other people are a smaller group, and they tend to know each other. Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's really interesting. Thank you, Jean-Pierre.
Okay.
Just a technical thing, Jean-Luc, if you could make me a host or a co-host again, I gave up my superpowers to you, but I would like them back. I think you can do that through clicking on participants. I'm not sure. Excuse the technical break here, and we will get to Marie Bedard's question. Bonsoir Marie. Vous pouvez poser des questions en français si c'est plus facile, pas de problème.
Merci beaucoup. Thanks very much, Deb and Jean-Luc. Thanks so much for an excellent presentation. It's much appreciated. And I'd love to be able to learn a bit more about all this. Can you give us some recommendations for parts of the Canadian Museum of History that we should be visiting, and any regional museums as well?
Well, you know, it's interesting you talk about regional museums. I think in something like 2010, I was contacted by a couple fellows from Deep River who had, you know, they had houses on the side of the river, and so in their spare times, they'd walk the beaches and they'd pick up artifacts. And one day they contacted me and they wanted me to have a look at it and tell them what it meant. So they had a range of materials and of objects that told the story, certainly of trade and of different time periods. And so we eventually put together a small exhibition at the Little Schoolhouse Museum in Deep River. So if you want to see local material, go there.
Okay. Okay. Thanks very much.
And another one is at Pikwakanagan, in the cultural center in Pikwakanagan in Golden Lake. You will find some archaeological materials that they have put on exhibit, and I'm sure that they will give you interpretations of those materials. Another place is in Kitigan-Zibi, at the Cultural Center in Kitigan-Zibi. That little exhibition that I put together a long time ago is now permanently housed there.
Okay.
So that's now at the Museum of History. You know, big bomber outfit. They look at big pictures and you can see some materials in the new Canadian History Hall. In fact, I'd encourage you to go to the Canadian History Hall, because Canadian history will start with Indigenous history.
Mhm.
Okay, it will start with the creation story of Sky Woman who's falling from the earth, and then it will continue on through ancient history and then early contacts, and you'll see some materials there. I don't know if you'll see any pieces from the area, but that's okay. The story is still a really good one to look at.
That's great. And for the Rocher aux Oiseaux, is that relatively easy to get to, or I'm not sure about
Oh no, you need a big boat.
Yeah,
Boat
okay.
with a strong motor.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember I went there once, and I was taking pictures, and somebody came up with a boat, and he says, "Well, if you want to, die, if you go over there, it's a lot better." I said, "Well, I'm not here to die. I'm here to take pictures of rock." I asked myself, what do I do? Do I tell? Is it a mistake to tell somebody what I'm doing? Well, I'm there, and I figured that the truth shall set you free. So I said, "I'm taking pictures of rock art." He says, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, there's rock paintings here." He says, "I've been coming here for 30 years. I've never seen anything." I said, "See that? There was a canoe with some people in it." And I think this is why, innocently, the people who go there with the spray paint, I don't think they understand that they don't see what's there.
That's
So
right.
they
Yeah.
We recently had a presentation by Joanne McCann at the archives in Shawville on Wazo Rock, or Wezo Rock as they call it locally, and it was an excellent presentation, and certainly she was talking about the kind of protection that's needed. If you're into a hike and you have a sturdy vehicle, there's a trail that takes you to the top of the rock that was put in place by the MRC Pontiac, and there's wonderful interpretive panels there as well. Have you been up there?
No, I'd love to go. I'd love to
Yes,
go. It sounds like a wonderful place.
Somebody should organize bus trips, because yes, the road can be rough, and it is a bit of a walk, but it is truly a magnificent sight.
Thanks
Yeah,
very much.
we've gone up there a few times, but we always went by canoe from Fort William. It's
Yes,
about a
yes.
5-mile paddle.
To see the actual rock art, you need to be on the water, but
Oh, I
it's
see.
also an experience to go up top. So,
Okay.
Diane or Xian, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you to you and Jean-Luc. Excellent, wonderful information. I'll just mention that I'm a member of the Outaouais Historical Society, and we did walk along the Outaouais River, where it is said that Champlain trekked along as well, and all of the trade that went down there, and how interesting to learn about where Odawa comes from, the people that were living. I could be saying this wrong, but the community of Indigenous people living up on near the Bruce Peninsula. And when I was looking at that, I was reading about how La Rivière aux Français, so French River, La Rivière aux Français was a major route as well, linking, I think, the Ottawa with Georgian Bay. Maybe
Absolutely.
Jean-Luc, would you know something about, you talked about the original bridge of water that was up there before the Great Lakes connected down to where I'm from, Windsor, Ontario. It did not connect there till 4,700 years ago. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Well, Harry's been on the French River. He knows the French River really well.
Many times.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic river. And virtually everybody all the explorers and no doubt voyageurs went through there. And it's a delightful place to go for a paddle. There's a lot of history down at the Georgian Bay end. There used to be a lot of lumbering going on there, and at one stage there was about 1,000 people living in a little community not far from Georgian Bay, and there's very little left that shows you that community, but there are some big old boilers that were too hard to get out of there, and they're still there.
Very interesting. Would that body of water have been in that link that you showed, Jean-Luc?
Yeah,
where
I think the Upper Great Lakes, when they drained down through the Mattawa, of course, Lake Nipissing and probably the French River, there's some corridor that would have followed there.
Yeah.
But it's interesting when you look at again, if you look at the landscape of the Great Lakes, and you think this is been here forever. Well, where Georgian Bay and Hudson and Lake Huron meet, there used to be falls there. There used to be falls, and in fact, they have recently found, because the waters of Lake Huron were lower at a certain time period, and they have found that they were caribou hunting blinds today under the waters of Lake Huron. So
wow.
it's amazing how lake levels and even the configurations of these large bodies of water have changed radically over thousands of years. They go up and they go down, and then the land tilts, and that changes everything once again.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to we mentioned Fort Severn, that's where I did some work years ago. It's right on the shores of Hudson Bay, in southern Hudson Bay. Well, every year there is more land being added to the north of Ontario. In fact, there are shipwrecks. I should give you a talk on shipwrecks someday that I was shown in 2017. There's a shipwreck there. The thing wrecked in 1889. I can show you some photographs of it sitting in about 3 or 4 feet of water. Today, it's 2 kilometers from the shores of Hudson Bay because the land is still bouncing up. It is a continuous process right now. It's about 3 feet, a meter every century. And when you've got a land that is so flat, it drops 6 feet every mile, well, you're adding a half a mile every century. Multiply by 5,000 years, and you've added a lot of landscape. So Ontario is a place that grows. Sounds like something I heard once.
Thank you.
I think it's their logo or whatever, right? A place to stand, a place to grow, Ontario. I remember that.
Exactly.
Shows how old I am. Yes. Catherine Fletcher, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Hello, everybody. And Jean-Luc, merci beaucoup for your wonderful, wonderful presentation. It's just been really excellent. I do have a question. The question is regarding Aylmer Island, which is, I think is actually on the Ontario side of the Ottawa River. I might be mistaken, but it's a site that has been used as an ancient burial ground, as you likely know. And recently there was a journalist who wrote a big article about it on his blog, and many of us who have read it, and it's an ethical question for all of us journalists, is exactly how to protect, what are the ethics of writing about it? And we all want to increase our knowledge and people's knowledge about such sites. But in that site particularly, people can canoe to it and have done. I think Edwin Souter was one of the first people who went. I might be wrong with the name, but the question really is how to protect a site like that.
Oh, you know, I thought somebody might ask me about this. When I saw the blog, I was somewhat dismayed. I'll be honest with you. I've been going to Elmer Island as an archaeological site. I've been doing that for several years. About nearly 10 years ago. Now, you know what happens when anybody finds human remains? The first thing you're supposed to do is call the police. Because who are you to determine that this isn't a result of a crime? Really, that is the law. You find human remains, call the police. There's no questions unless you feel that you are capable of making a determination that it's ancient and it's not of interest to the police. So first thing is we call the police. So about 10 years ago, that's what I did. I called the coroner. And you're right, the island is technically the responsibility of the province of Ontario. And the Department of Fisheries and Oceans lease it so that they can put their lighthouse on it. And so when Edwin Souter went, he went because Monsieur Boucher, who was the lighthouse keeper, when he was digging the foundations to put up the lighthouse, he started to find human remains. So 10 years ago, the coroner goes there. I was there and so was my colleague, Dr. Janet Young, who's a physical anthropologist. And they made the determination that the human remains that we saw at the time were ancient and not of police interest. And since the island has been declared by the cemeteries branch of whatever department it is in ministry in Ontario, it is declared to be an unmarked cemetery. So I don't think there is any issue here. Nobody would go to Beechwood Cemetery or Notre Dame Cemetery in Ottawa and say, I know that there's real nice buttons to be found if I dig deep enough here. Okay? We have to accord this place the respect that it is due to its nature. That said, the Algonquin and Anishinaabe are involved with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in determining what takes place there in terms of activities by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So they are quite aware, they are involved. What to do to protect it? You know, I think the best thing you could do would be to propagate and further encourage the growth of poison ivy. Because sadly, that's what it's used for. It's used as a bathroom. Again, could you imagine anyone going into Beechwood Cemetery and behaving that way? No. So anyway, to get back to the blog, the blog was really basing a lot of its content on the writings of Edwin Souter. There have been since Edwin Souter a lot more thought given to and investigations of. There have been no excavations that I know of. A lot more understanding of even what Souter describes. I mean, for example, well, yes, I won't go any further than that. So what to do? I don't know, but I certainly think that bringing a nearly ghoulish attention to the place is not in its best interest.
Protection is certainly a big issue, and one can hope that education plays a role. I know Joanne McCann was talking about the importance of that in protecting Oiseau Rock, although as you showed with all the graffiti there, maybe it's too late, but it isn't. And but at the same time, it is very, very difficult. As many people as you can educate, there will always be people who are not willing to be educated, and that's a problem. Catherine, do you have another question?
Well, I just wanted to add, Jean-Luc, I've never been there. I just feel it's best to leave things be personally. But I wondered if there's any explanation in English and French and Algonquin actually on the island. Is there any signage? No.
Not
Thank
that
you
I've
very
ever
much.
seen. But I think that, it's really hard to hide the fact. Maybe that is an approach that would be beneficial, is to be upfront and say, look, this is a cemetery, respect it. It might stop some.
It might stop, and I think that I'm a great advocate for education, which is what you're doing tonight. It's just anyway, thank you very much. It's a big topic. Thank you.
You're
That that island is a very popular spot for people going, stopping and having a picnic, going for a swim. We've been there many times with the sailboat or the canoe, and we haven't seen anybody being disrespectful to it. And maybe the odd person might go and have a pee, but other than that, we haven't seen anybody digging around or anything like that.
That's always a good sign. Are there other questions? I'm not sure. I may have lost my superpowers and I can't see if somebody's got their hand up, but I don't see any hands up.
I just have one more. You mentioned native copper up on the west part of Superior. And my wife and I canoed through that whole area, and there's a number of small islands where there was mines done a long time ago. And I did some research when I saw the evidence, and the government has put out these actual, side views of what the mines looked like, how deep they were, and so on and so forth. But we actually came on very shallow water where we could see native copper just below our canoes. Oh, it was interesting. So it's readily available, for the natives in those days.
And copper is interesting. There was a book by Hans Georg Pohl, K-O-H-L, late 1800s, and he was a German traveler through southern Lake Superior. And he mentions how people there, the indigenous people and Métis, they would keep pieces of copper in a small pouch as medicine, as a way of protecting themselves against the powers of big bodies of water and rapids and such like, because the copper was said to be like the scales of the Mishipishu, this mythical being, horned a serpent that lived in rushing waters and big lakes, and if you weren't respectful, it would come and bite you on the butt. So you needed this to protect yourself. Oh, hey, it can happen on a large body of water in a wind, right?
Yeah. We need more of those things. Rick, you have a question?
Yes, well, not a question, actually a remark just to concerning Aylmer Island, and that is that when Andrew King's article appeared, his blog appeared, it was spread through the Historical Society of Ottawa and Bytown and whatnot. Over the recent years, I know there's been an awful lot of interest. I live in Aylmer as well, so there's an awful lot of interest amongst people in Aylmer. There have been some finds recently over the last 4 years. And I think when we're talking about, when people say, well, we should just leave the island alone, the island has always been a place where boaters visit. And I would dare say that a lot of boaters don't know the element, the sacred element, if you will, that this is a burial ground. To me, the one of the solutions that will certainly prevent despoiling of the site, but also even the people using it as a bathroom, is the signage. And I think because it is so widely known, and Andrew King is a local author now, it's even more widely known than it ever was as a result of his blog. And I would suggest that if there was some way to get some signage up, very discreet signage, but put around the island, to me it is the obvious solution to say it'll keep at least the curiosity seekers away. And it would be, you could do it very respectfully in all three languages, English, French, and Anishinabe Algonquin, and make sure that people are at least aware. But even more, I think more importantly, when there has been discoveries in the past, and I've heard of at least 3, it was by teenagers. And I'm not sure that they were completely aware of how you're not supposed to be looking for artifacts. You're not supposed to be digging in an indigenous cemetery. And Jean-Luc, you made the point very, very well that you wouldn't go to Beechwood Cemetery, you wouldn't go to St. James, you wouldn't do that. They wouldn't do that either. So the fact is that the signage, I think, would solve the whole thing. Jean-Luc, thank you very much for your presentation, by the way. Very, very, very interesting. Thank you.
Good to see you, Rick. Jean-Pierre, you have another question?
Yes, Jean-Luc, thank you very much. It has to do, my question has to do with your work that you did at Fort Severn. I was wondering if you have published anything about that.
Oh my, you can't shut me up when it comes to Fort Severn.
Time.
No. I would simply tell you, go to academia.edu.
Okay.
Look up my name, and I've got all sorts of things there.
Thank you very much.
That's excellent. I don't see any more questions. And as we're coming up to 9 o'clock shortly, I think that might be a good time to for me to close things, if that's okay with everybody. I really can't thank you enough, Jean-Luc, for your generous sharing of your time and your experience, not just tonight, but also during our digs last fall, and your continuing support of our Archeo-Pontiac project. I'd just like to mention this project of the Friends of Shaw Falls, Archeo-Pontiac. Jean-Luc had some pictures in his slideshow, which is very, very kind. The aim of the project is to test the interest in and lay the foundations for a public archaeological dig programs in the municipality of Pontiac, which is pretty like a wacky idea, because I mean, how many areas have public archaeological dig programs? Targeting both elementary school students, high school students, and community members. And we had, as Jean-Luc mentioned, very successful digs last fall, and we hope to continue that this fall. What we'll have between now and then, I'm not 100% sure of, but follow us on our Facebook page for the news of what's going on. And I must, in case any of them are listening, or because all of you are listening, is to thank our funders for the Archeo-Pontiac project, which is the cultural fund from the MRC des Collines, and also the Desjardins, Caisse Populaire Desjardins, who are very generous in supporting community projects of all different sorts, as well as the municipality of Pontiac and the municipality of Bristol, who give us some money every year just so we can keep going and pay our Zoom fees for for having a presentation like this. I'm sure I've forgotten something, but I'd just like to thank you all for attending, and please follow us on Facebook, and I see Kathleen, you have your hand up again.
Yes, I
Different Kathleen, sorry.
je suis arrivée en retard, donc j'ai raté la moitié de la présentation. I'm wondering, I see that you are recording and where we can have the full presentation. Est-ce que ça va être accessible?
Oui,
Et
nous avons
comment?
une chaîne YouTube. Je
OK.
l'ai mentionné au début de la présentation. Nous avons quelques présentations là au sujet des richesses naturelles de la région. Et si tout va bien, je vais mettre la présentation de ce soir sur la chaîne YouTube aussi.
OK. Thank you so much.
Oh,
Thank you, Jean-Luc.
Salut,
Thanks,
Kathleen.
Jean-Luc.
Pleasure.
So thank you very much. And if no one else has anything to say, then I will just say good night.
À la
Thank you
vista.
for